Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture on AWS. I am Manas Mohammed and today we are going to learn about AWS IAM. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. So moving on to the next slide, basically when you create an account in the AWS console, you have been given an access as a root user. So users in AWS are classified into two types. First one is the root user, who's the administrator and he's got the full access over the AWS account. The second one is the IAM user. IAM user is also called as the normal user who can be given either, like the accesses for like a particular service in AWS, or you can give an access to like an administrator, or so you can create an access to the individual user. So root user is the admin user who has got the admin privileges. He can do any changes, and the IAM user is nothing but a normal user who can be given customized permissions so that he could actually go in and use that particular service. So one thing to remember is IAM is a free service and it is global. It is not regional. Moving on, this is the IAM console. So IAM console, you can see you've got the users here, you've got groups, you've got policies and roles and identity providers as well. Here in this console, you can also see, you can actually create a set of, MFA. You can actually create a multi-factor authentication, which is linked to your own device. You can use the Google Authenticator to actually, push the code so that even if your password is being hacked, nobody can get into your system because they would be needing the access to the physical device that's been linked as well. So this is what IAM is all about. So let's go inside IAM and learn a bit more about what IAM is. IAM is basically comprised of four important aspects. First is the users, groups, policies, and roles. So user is it is like an individual person or an identity that actually uses the AWS service. Groups, as you can see, is a collection of users. Permissions are just like policies that is being assigned to the users in groups. Roles are another concept wherein you have got roles to actually assign them so that these two AWS services can interact with each other. So we'll go in depth in the next coming slides. Moving over, so what is an IAM user? IAM user is nothing but an individual or an identity that actually uses AWS resources. Like I create an IAM user saying Anas who can actually use the S3 resources. I'll create another user named Alice who can actually use the EC2 instance, and I'd be just giving the read-only access so that she cannot actually make any changes in the AWS environment. That's how IAM users actually work. So first important thing you have to learn, it is a free service and it has got like you can create multiple users on the IAM, and it is a global service. That means it's like all over the world. It's not based on one particular region. So when we do the hands-on, we can actually see it's a global service as well. So moving forward, okay, so credentials are very important as far as IAM is considered, because when you create a user, you can actually download the credentials from the IAM console, and those credentials are not to be shared with anyone. It is your own credentials. While creating a user, you can actually, ensure that you can do password encryption as well. So that would be actually coming on when we're doing the hands-on on the IAM user. So moving forward to the groups, groups are nothing but collection of IAM users. Like I've got a group for administrators, I've got a group for developers, I've got a group for testing, for finance. So what I do is I create a group and I give permissions to the group. Like let's consider the admin. Admin would be having the admin privileges. So I attach the admin permissions to this group. So by attaching the permissions to the group, Bob and Susan would be having the admin permissions inherited because they are in the same group. And developers, I would be giving them, like, let's consider the right access for the EC2 instances and the storage services. So a developer like Brad, Jim, Mark, they would be inheriting the services, the policies that's been attached to the group as well. And they would also be having their own permissions. Like Brad might be having their own individual permissions. So a group is actually, like a person in the group would actually have its own individual permissions, like Brad would be having its own individual permissions while creating the user that has been given to him, and he would also inherit the properties or the permissions of a group as well. And this is about the groups. So let's see. The most important thing you'll have to understand is we cannot have nested groups. So like you've got a group of admins, and in the group of admins you've got Bob and Susan. You cannot have another group beneath that. So nested groups are not allowed. So users in a group automatically inherit the permissions that are being assigned to the group. The group admin is given the permissions of an administrator. So Bob and Susan would automatically inherit the permissions that are being assigned to them. So moving on to the groups. So as I told you, we've got a developers group, we've got the audit team group, you've got the operations team. So Alice, Bob, Charles are given permissions and they inherit the developers policies permissions as well. And the operations would have their own David and Edward. We would be having given the access to the operations. They inherit the policies that are being given to the operations group. But now, if you see, there's another group, and like David is in another group called audit team, and Charles also is in the audit team. So the thing is, now Charles would actually inherit the permissions of developers as well as the audit team because he's both in both the groups. Similarly, David will also be having the permissions of his own, like individual permissions, the group permissions of the operations, and the group permissions of the audit team. Fred would be having his own individual permissions that's been assigned to him when he was actually created. So that's how permissions in users and groups work. So this is what we have actually learned. It's like we have created three groups, and Charles and David are a part of like multiple groups. So they would inherit the properties of operations as well as the audit teams as well. So because Fred is not part of any group, he would be having his own individual permissions only. Now, policies in AWS are actually divided into inline as well as managed policies. Now, managed policies are like AWS managed and customer managed policies. Inline policies are actually, if you really want a person to use that EC2 server, and in that EC2 server, you just want to use that particular resource, that's where you use the inline policies. So even in EC2, we want that user to only use that particular service, we create an inline policies. Now managed are reusable. Okay, they are actually provided by AWS, which is called the AWS managed policies or the customer managed policies as well. So let's look at the example of one of the policies here. So this is a policy and the effect is allow. What is important is we have to see, like whenever you create a policy, this is actually in a JSON format. Okay. Now in this policy, we can actually see this is the version. This is a version of the JSON document and the statement. Now the effect is like we are allowing the user to actually get into like S3, get an S3 list. So it's been given the S3 read only access. So it can go to the S3 bucket and it can actually fetch the data. It could actually read. It cannot make any changes. It cannot do like versioning. It cannot do any other like write operations on it. So this is allow. The effect is allow, and we have given them the permissions for read-only access for this. Let's have a look at another policy. Here, the effect is actually deny. And the action asterisk. Okay, this is a special identifier, which is, that means like anyone or all. So this is an interesting policy. If you have a look, it's got the version of the JSON document, it's got deny, all, and the condition that we have given here is like we are only allowing this IP address, which is 192.0.2.0/24, and the ranges of 203.0.113.0/24. So these two ranges would only be allowed to get into our environment, and the other like other IP addresses would not be allowed. So this is a secure practice. Like this is totally like, let's consider we've got an organization and we've got these IP addresses running in our organization. So we're giving the access only to these the CIDR blocks that we call them. So that's how we have actually created a policy. So the effect is like, as I told you, it's deny. It only allows these two. So these is how the policies are actually being created in the JSON document. The last aspect is roles. The roles, they are similar to IAM users, but They are not associated to a single person. Like, let's consider I've got an EC2 instance and I want the EC2 instance to actually interact with any of the AWS service or like to communicate with another service. For that, we have got roles. So I would be creating a role wherein I would be selecting like EC2 instance should be in a position to interact with the S3 service. I create a role and I attach the role to the EC2 instance. This is how the roles work. So for one service in AWS to interact with another service in AWS, we create a role as well. So that's how things work in the AWS environment. There's another thing for roles, like when you install an AWS CLI into the Linux-based operating system, it is a Python-based environment. So what happens is you can actually create a role in that so that the AWS CLI user could actually communicate to another service in AWS rather than having the access keys and the secret access keys in the server. It is better to create a role. So we'll be learning that in the coming lecture. So moving on, so what we have actually learned is IAM is a global service. It is a free service provided by AWS. It comprises of users, groups, policies, as well as roles. So users are like individuals or identity that access the AWS resource. Groups are a collection of users and they inherit the permissions of the group. They've got the individual permissions. There are no nested groups as well that are allowed in AWS. So an individual user can be assigned to multiple groups. Moving on to policies, policies are nothing but permissions that have been given to users, groups that can allow an AWS resource or that can deny an AWS resource. They are basically written in JSON document. It has got effect, which says allow or deny, and then you've got the action on it. So roles are something like if you want one AWS resource like the EC2 to communicate with another EC2 instance, like the database instances, so you create a role so that they could actually communicate with each other. So that's how the IAM actually works. And I hope you like the lecture. And I would be getting back with another lecture. We'll be doing the hands-on in the next lecture. Thank you.